get that started. Okay.
Hi, we'll start in about 3 minutes. We'll just make sure that everyone's able to log on and get started in a few. So thank you for waiting. Okay, why don't we get started? Thank you for being with us. Welcome. My name is Anji Ritsingani. I'm the Executive Director of IRIS, which is the Institute for Regional and International Studies at UW-Madison. I'm also a former professor of Latin American Caribbean history at UW-Stevens Point. So I'm especially pleased to introduce our topic today, which is the Haitian Revolution, its impact on the world, featuring UW-Madison history professor, Dr. Brenda Plummer. Before I introduce Dr. Plummer, I'd just like to make a few announcements. First, as you saw, the event is being recorded, but it's only recording the speakers, not the participants. So you're free to keep your camera on or off as you prefer. Participants, though, will be muted for the duration of the talk. Secondly, we'll be making Professor Plummer's slides available to all participants after the event, so no need to try to scribble notes down. And finally, we encourage your questions. That's what this is for. So please put those in the chat box. You can either do that during the talk or at the end when we have time for Q&A, but we'd certainly like to hear your questions. And I'd like to introduce Essie Lenchner, who is going to be assisting us with the technical aspects of the event. Thank you, Essie. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Brenda Gale Plummer. Professor Plummer received her PhD at Cornell University. She teaches jointly in the departments of History and Afro-American Studies at UW-Madison. Her major research interests are the history of US foreign relations, race and international affairs, African-American history, and Caribbean history. Among other publications, Professor Plummer is the author of 2 books and 9 articles on Haiti. Welcome, Professor Plummer.
Thank you. And thank you for that introduction and for Iris's support for this, this talk. I'm assuming that most of you have seen the film that was selected to accompany this. It centers on Toussaint Louverture, and that's an excellent way to put some cohesion into the study of the Haitian Revolution, particularly for K through 12. What I'd like to do is to provide some additional context to that. I think that once we get into the weeds, we find out that the Haitian Revolution is actually a rather complex event, right? And it has incredible resonance and consequences for the contemporary period. But we can talk about that in greater detail as we go ahead. So how did this begin? Well, during the Columbian era of the 1490s, the island that native people, the indigenous inhabitants, called Haiti, was christened San Domingo. And it was a Spanish possession and remained a Spanish possession entirely until 1697, when French adventurers encroached on the western coast of the island and began to populate it with French settlers. Spain conceded in the, at the end of the 17th century to the French presence. And so what we got then was a divided island with the eastern part being Hispanophone, right? And the eastern, the western part being Francophone, okay? So today we have on that same island of Haiti, the country of the Dominican Republic in the east and Haiti in the west. So the French, like other European colonizers of the New World, established plantation slavery as the economic mode with which they would pursue their profits there. The slavery that they established was particularly brutal, and I guess we can have the second slide so you can see that. Saint-Domingue the French version of San Domingo, was enormously profitable colony for France. It was a particularly brutal colony in terms of the way that enslaved people were treated. The slave trade continued for the duration of the colonial period because of the need for constant replacement, because of the short lifespan that enslaved people suffered, during this period. It was also marked by slave insurrection. The revolution itself was not the first instance of slave insurgency. There were rebellions throughout the history. Some of the fugitives from slavery were able to escape into the mountainous terrain of the country. And these are people that in English are called maroons. Okay? The economy was heavily based on sugar, but there was also coffee, cotton, and indigo, the indigo dye being produced. And this etching on the right is just a drawing of the kind of indigo factory that was produced. I think the importance of this particular drawing is that it shows you, the sort of the industrial scale with which this plantation agriculture was conducted. I couldn't find a comparable, at least in the short time I was looking for one. I couldn't find a comparable drawing of a sugar mill, which would have been even more impressive in terms of the way in which we're looking almost at a proto-industrial kind of method of work. Okay? So this was the regime, right? One in which discipline was enforced, through all kinds of beatings, floggings, torture, and in which there was really no security, right, other than could be exerted through violence. Okay, I guess the next slide. So who was benefiting from all of this? Okay? Often when we think of France in the 17th and 18th centuries, we think of the gilded furniture, in the style of the various kings, precious metals, luxe fabrics, and so on and so forth. Right? But the foundations of this wealth were in Caribbean slavery. Saint-Domingue was the wealthiest colony that France had at the time, and was really bankrolling a lot of this splendor. Right? I thought that this painting on the right was particularly apt to explain or to express one of the aspects of the meaning of slavery. It is a painting of two daughters of Louis XIV, and in the painting, a Black servant, most likely enslaved, right? Even though fancily dressed, right? Is offering some kind of, food to one of the daughters. The other daughter is holding a Black dog, right? there is a in the visuals of this painting an equivalence being drawn between the slave child and the dog. Right? Both are dependents. Both are pets in a sense. Right? But I think we also see in this sort of the guise of kindly and benevolent domesticity, a way in which the violence of slavery is in fact hidden. Okay, I guess we can go on to the next one. So back in the colony itself, all right, we have a highly hierarchical society. It is a society in which you can say it consisted of 4 classes. Right? Most of the people were enslaved. There was a class of free people of color, most but not all of whom were biracial. Small population of whites of modest income. These were sailors, artisans, craftsmen, people of that rank, and even smaller class of wealthy planters and merchants. Okay? The society was one in which people were kept in their place. It was a society that had what were called sumptuary laws. Right? These are laws governing what people could wear, according to what rank they occupied in society. And people of color and slaves were not supposed to wear hats. And the colorful bandanas that you see even today on women in Martinique, are a remnant of this custom, right? So the woman in the middle of the illustration who is wearing a hat, all right, it will be in a position to take that hat off real quick if required. Right? So there were customs and ways in which people were meant to occupy a particular place in the society. Now, when revolution broke out in France, the free people of color were accorded citizenship rights in 1792, and we'll get into the revolution in a minute. And this according of status to them was a cause of friction and conflict in the colony. It was particularly opposed by the small elite that controlled, the colony, and that wished to maintain the status quo. Many of the small wealthy class were royalists. They were opposed to the ideology of the revolution, and saw it as most disruptive and subversive of a slave-holding society. Might add also, you don't need to go back. I was just going to add that free people of color could also be slaveholders. Slavery, right, is an ancient institution, right? As we know, dates back to antiquity, Greece, Rome, so on. Right? But what was characteristic of Atlantic slavery is the increasing degree to which it becomes a racial slavery, right? In which slavery is increasingly associated with African descent, right? And have a little bit more to say about that in a minute. Okay, so how is it then that the Haitian Revolution is different from any of the slave revolts that had occurred in Saint-Domingue in the past? Well, um, some things were taking place in the world, particularly in those countries and territories bordering the Atlantic, that had a major influence on how this revolution came to be and the character that it would have. Okay, one of them had to do with the politics of the period, with the rivalries between the leading European powers. I have this picture of Olaudah Equiano, who's more famous as having recorded or having written a slave narrative than he is as an Atlantic presence as such, right? But during part of his life, he was a sailor, and he was again among thousands employed at sea, on rivers within colonies in the Americas, on coastwise vessels. Sometimes these sailors were even when they were enslaved, or quasi-independent, in that they could be captains of ships. They were entrusted with various kinds of responsibilities. And they also, as a result, were often the recipients and the conveyors of news. Right? So their ability to move around the Atlantic world, right, to participate in the 7 Years' War, to participate in the American Revolution, right, provided them with information about current events, including slave insurrections, but also provided them information about the ideologies underpinning some of these events. Right? For example, Britain and France and Spain were all in contest with one another for control over territories on this side of the Atlantic. They made and broke alliances with each other and so on. At the time of the American Revolution, the Americans sought and received support from France. Right? And in 1778, one Count d'Estaing mounted an expedition to help the Americans oust the British out of Savannah, Georgia. And in recruiting people for this expedition, he recruited free people of color, as well as enslaved people, men who he promised would be emancipated if they agreed to go and fight. Right? Although this particular mission failed to get the British out of Savannah, what we do find is that a number of future Haitians got military experience in this campaign, and possibly also were exposed to the ideology that the Americans were promoting at the time about freedom and independence. One of them who went to Georgia with d'Estaing was Henry Christophe. At the time, he was 12 years old. He was employed as a drummer. That's an impressionable age, right? So he came away from the American Revolution with some ideas about militarism, some ideas about independence, some practical ideas about how to fight. So when we're talking about what contributed to the Haitian Revolution, one of the major things, again, was the politics and the ideologies circulating in the Atlantic world during this particular era. So I guess we can move on to the next slide. Obviously, another factor was the revolution in France itself. Right? People were talking about the rights of man. People were talking about liberty, equality, fraternity. Right? Ideas were very much lacking in Saint-Domingue, right? Which was a society, directly contradicting this. Right? Unlike the American Revolution, the French Revolution was much more of a thoroughgoing social revolution in terms of upsetting the apple cart, disturbing relations between classes, creating forms of discourse, of rhetoric, of art, all kinds that was really unprecedented in European society. In this particular illustration, the sans-culottes, this was a term for the working class people who did not wear the knee breeches that were worn by the middle classes and by the upper classes in France. Right? We think of culottes being, like capri pants, right? And so, again, as in Saint-Domingue, there were sort of, customs pertaining to people's rank in society and how they were dressed. The emblems of the French Revolution included what's called a Phrygian Cap, a cap that's shape is based on old Greek models, and also the cockade, which was the pin in the cap. Right? When people from revolutionary France who supported the revolution came to the colonies, even people who could not read, right? Who didn't read any of these proclamations that were coming out of Paris, they could see, right? The visual political language that was being put out by the revolution, which people would therefore have some access to. See, what else did I want to say about this? Yeah, okay. So another aspect of the French Revolution too was the growing discomfort with slavery, right? The incompatibility of slavery with the ideology of the revolution. And so in 1794, the National Convention in Paris abolishes slavery in all French colonies. Right? Now, of course, the growing tension between the planter class in Saint-Domingue, the free people of color, and the enslaved people led to some curious alliances. Right? It led to and again, if you get into the details of the Haitian Revolution, there are episodes where various factions are siding with the different countries. In planters, at one point are siding with Spain to try to get Spain to help them defeat what they consider to be the radicalism of the revolution. Right? Uh, so that is one aspect of this. Another is that because of the opposition in France to slavery, an abolitionist society, the Friends of the Society of the Friends of the Blacks, lobbied the French government and were successful by 1794 in getting that government to abolish slavery, right? And you know, leading again to the increase in the wars taking place within Saint-Domingue. Right? So all of this stuff is happening concurrently, right? And there's another major factor that I want to bring out, and I want to put all these together, right? Because they're we're not really talking about a linear process here. We're really talking about a lot of concurrent and intersecting and events. Right? Okay, I guess next slide we can do. Another major, and many historians think the major influence on the Haitian Revolution was Voodoo. Right? Which is a religion, right? It's not black magic, right? It is a religion that provided and still provides psychic and spiritual comfort to people living then under horrific circumstances, in contemporary Haiti, living under trying circumstances. And so a legend has come down that the slave revolt that began in northern Haiti in 1791, which was the trigger for the entire nationwide or island-wide insurrection, right, was held in a forest, literally the alligator woods, right, in a forest near the city of Cape Haitian, you know, led by two religious leaders, at which the insurrection was planned. Not everybody thinks that this actually happened. You know, nations sometimes, you know, create foundational myths, right? We have, for example, George Washington chopping down a cherry tree, right? There's no empirical data for the meeting, but there is certainly empirical data for the insurrection, right? The insurrection essentially brought down the slavery regime, right, as it spread throughout the country. Right? There are a number of renditions by Haitian painters of this episode in Haitian history. This happens just to be one of them. So these influences, the circulation of ideas, the prior slave rebellions, the French Revolution, the influence of Voodoo, disagreements and dissensions among the various constituent classes, right? All of these provided an opening, right? An opening for insurrection, right? Which began in 1791 and continued through until the Declaration of Haitian Independence in 1804. Okay. Now, why did it take so long? Well, part of it is because, again, of these shifting alliances and the interference in French affairs of Britain and France. Excuse me, of Britain and Spain, right? With different factions allying themselves with different powers at different times, with the loss of control by some factions of certain parts of the country, the gaining of control by others, right? And part of that has to do, I think, speaks to the Toussaint Louverture movie. So we have the next slide. Okay, as the film suggests, there was a rivalry between Toussaint and Sontenax, right? The French commissioner that was sent out to restore order and who, without the approval of the National Convention, abolished slavery in Haiti before the actual convention did so. And Toussaint had allied himself with Spain. He came back to France after 1794, after slavery was abolished. I think what's particular about these three leaders, right, is that they demonstrate the fact that in the course of this 1791-1804 period, this rebellion is becoming militarized. Right? These men were powerful generals, right, who headed their own armies. Right? They had the potential, which they ultimately did, of bringing all of this together, right? But there's also a centrifugal influence here, right, where things could fly apart and did, right, for large portions of this, this period in which constant warfare was taking place. Right? The film made allusion to the problem of militarism in subsequent Haitian life, right? Well, the beginning of it is here, right? These were, by the time of the Declaration of Independence, these were seasoned militarists, right? And they were able to defeat the French army because of that. There's often a lot of talk about how, one of the reasons why France ultimately lost Saint-Domingue was because of yellow fever, right, of which European troops did not have immunities. But what's often underestimated is the ability of these people to put forces in the field and to effectively conduct military campaigns. Okay, we can go to the next one. Okay, the revolution in France was in trouble, right? And in the 1790s, there was a great deal of dissension about how the country should be run, about the role of exporting the revolution, about revolutionary purity, about trust. And so, we have in 1793, the famous terror, right? Where everybody seemed to be cutting off everybody else's head. Right? Well, the problem was compounded by the reaction to the revolution of the monarchies of Europe, right? Which saw French republicanism and radicalism as threats to the status quo, as threats to the order that they wanted to maintain in Europe. Right? So Napoleon, here on the left, comes in to save the day. Right? He's another militarist, right? A Corsican soldier who becomes a head of state and fights wars in Europe that extend France's influence and that to some degree neutralize the ability of the of other European powers to call all of the shots on that continent. Okay? So Napoleon aims to reconquer Saint-Domingue, right? Which by the time he is ready to do that, it's being managed for France by Toussaint, who Napoleon does not trust, and whose authority he believes weakens the control that France can exert over affairs in the colony. So this is where he sends Leclerc's army to Saint-Domingue in an effort to bring the blacks to heel, and he is a pro-slavery person. His wife Josephine, of course, is from a family that owned a plantation in the colonies, but he loses. Right? He's unable ultimately to conquer the people who would become Haitians. Right? And so with hopes for a American empire dashed, France sells the Louisiana territory to the United States, right? A vast swath of land. Okay, so following the deportation of Toussaint to France, Dessalines becomes the head of state, declares Haitian independence in 1804. So I just want to say a couple of things about the consequences of the Haitian Revolution, right? For both Haiti and for the world, really. For one thing, Haiti becomes the first modern Black nation state. Okay? It becomes the first independent state in Latin America. It becomes the first country to write anti-racism into its constitution. It becomes the first country that has to deal with what we now call underdevelopment. The first country in the so-called, what we now would call the global South, right? To deal with this whole issue of, how do you, create a thriving society out of one that was founded on the principle of exploitation. Next slide. Another consequence was the role of what is now Haiti, and what became Haiti, in spreading a revolutionary ideology in Latin America. Right? So we have Simon Bolivar, a revolutionist in trouble with the authorities in I guess what might have been called then Grand Colombia. Took refuge in Haiti. Right? He was helped by Pétion to amass the military equipment for an invasion. And this help was extended with the promise that Bolivar would abolish slavery in any Spanish territory that he would be able to liberate. Just as France was spreading revolutionary ideas in Europe, and much to the chagrin of many of the monarchies, right? We find Haiti is playing this role in Latin America, and aiding and abetting efforts of Latin American countries and encouraging them to take anti-slavery initiatives. Next slide. Okay, so Dessalines is said to have taken the French flag, the tricolore, which has blue, white, and red stripe. It said that he took his sword and stripped the white out of the tricolore to come up with the Haitian flag. Right? This flag is interesting because of its visual references. Unity makes strength, right? Which that was a signal accomplishment of the revolution, right? To bring all these people, different factions together. Right? But in addition to that, we also have the royal palm, always a symbol of majesty, right, in the Caribbean context. We have the Phrygian cap at the top of it, right? That the symbol of the revolution in France, right? Then we have all this military hardware, right? And part of the message in that is that Haiti will defend itself, right? Which it had to do because after the independence, that didn't mean that there weren't attempts to reconquer, right? There were efforts in the 19th century to recolonize Haiti, and a part of its stance as a nation was built on a defensive posture, a defensive stance toward outside interference, right? Which was coupled tragically by efforts then by the great powers to isolate it and to prevent its ideas and its example from spreading to other parts of the world. So I've sort of talked from about 45 minutes. I guess, might be a good place to stop and perhaps get into some discussion or questions.
Great, thank you so much for that. Please put your questions in the chat box. And in the meantime, I thought I might just get started with a question, if that's okay. Could you say a little bit more about the abolition of slavery in the wake of the Haitian Revolution, how this impacted European powers and the United States to decide to abolish the slave trade, abolish slavery, and also maybe you can talk about Santo Domingo and the role that Haiti played in ending slavery there as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, for starters, the Haitian Revolution meant that no slave-holding power could be entirely comfortable and assured that their regime would continue. So what we have happening is the prohibition on people from Haiti coming to other countries in the Americas. Right? The United States, for example, banned Black sailors from Haiti from disembarking from their ships onto American soil. In other countries, the Spanish also tried to ban the immigration of any French-speaking Black people from their colonies. Again, because of the circulation of ideas in the Atlantic world, enslaved people in other places knew what had happened in Haiti, and some took inspiration from this. So we have, for example, the Gabriel plot in Virginia, in which the idea was to seize ships and to sail to Haiti. Right? So the revolution disrupted the status quo. And as far as Santo Domingo is concerned, one of the things that the Haitians did, and again, this is a part of their defensive foreign policy, was to invade Santo Domingo, right? For the purposes of making sure that it would not be used as a place to as a point of departure for invading forces. Right? And it was quite likely that that could be the case because at the time Santo Domingo was relatively sparsely populated. It was a society that had not had big plantation development. It was in many respects still a small scale agricultural farming and ranching society. Right? So the aftermath of this was that Haiti becomes a kind of an international pariah as far as the major colonial powers are concerned. It also has to maintain this defensive posture to prevent re-enslavement. Right? Because what the French did is that they actually wound up reinstating slavery in their other colonies, in Martinique and Guadeloupe, which I think lasted until like 1848 or so. Right? So there's a real danger. The British maintained slavery until the 1830s. There's a real danger of re-enslavement, and so this created kind of the foundation for what takes place later on in the 19th century, as far as Haiti's relations with other countries are concerned.
Great, thank you. We do have a question about Dessalines, and in particular, why Toussaint has become such an important figure, not only within Haiti, but also in terms of the Atlantic world, in terms of revolutions in general, and yet Dessalines remains largely forgotten among those of us who don't, enjoy studying the Caribbean to this level of detail. But why is that? Why has Dessalines become much less of a major presence in discussing the Haitian Revolution?
Well, the fact that he ordered a massacre of the remaining white people didn't help. But I think more than that, Toussaint, his goal was to run the colony for France, right? As kind of an executive officer. Right? And as the film indicated, he then allowed or actually enforced forced labor, right, on the plantations, right? then why would somebody who was opposed to slavery then enact forced labor? Well, we're talking about this development problem again, right? The planter class is essentially expelled, right? But how is money going to be raised? How is a government going to get revenue, right? The revenue has to come from plantation crops, right? In a system which had historically been, performed with cheapened labor, right? With unpaid labor, right? And so his solution was, to return Saint-Domingue to profitability was to, restore the plantation economy, right? So he can be likened to, I don't know, maybe what you want to call it, some of our contemporary neo-colonial leaders or administrators, right, who have not broken, with, metropolitan systems of exploitation and control, right? And so I think he's a sympathetic figure, right, because he was, associated with loyalty to France and commitment to, a lot of French ideas about governance, right? Whereas Dessalines was, less connected, to that particular kind of vision, once Toussaint was out of the picture, it was clear that France did not have any intentions of permitting the sort of liberal administration, right? So independence was from that point on essentially inevitable, especially if France was talking about reinstating slavery.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question, which is about books or websites connected to the Haitian Revolution. So particularly those that might be accessible for high school students. And we will also be sending not only Dr. Plummer's slides, but also some additional teaching materials to our participants today. But it's just important to note that most world history textbooks, even today, still say very little about the Haitian Revolution. So what else could we do for our teachers and students to augment that?
Mm-hmm. Okay, as far as books, I don't really know. I mean, having never taught K through 12, I don't really have a sense of what the students are like. There is, one of the people who was featured in the film, Laurent Dubois. His film, his book, Avengers of the New World, would be useful. There's also a historian named Carolyn Fick, F-I-C-K, who's written a lot on the revolution, as well as someone named David Geggus, Geggus. Of course, the classic, the old classic, is C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins, right? Which is highly readable, but again, subsequent work has improved on that in terms of the empirical base. Right? What I would imagine you might need to do is to kind of adapt that some of that material for high school student use. I noticed one of the things the film I thought did well is it sort of alluded to all of the violence and brutality of slavery in Saint-Domingue, without getting into the details. Right? So I think with some of this, you would probably need to do some, I don't know, redacting on some of no, yes, no, trigger warnings, something, all right, because it really is not a a pretty story, right, of the slavery regime that took place during that colonial period.
Great, and I would also recommend as well Laurent Dubois' book on, it's called Haiti, the Aftershocks of History, which was after the earthquake, so I'll also put that in the chat bar. Okay, we have a question about if the film got anything wrong. And I noticed some moments where I was like, it didn't really go on like that. But what could you tell our teachers that could be helpful to them? Where does the film kind of slip over some details that might be important for them to know? And, you know, in other words, like where could they kind of find spaces to critique the film, which might be helpful for their students to get involved with?
What I perceived was not so much stuff that was wrong, but just the focus on Toussaint, right? Which, I mean, clearly it's films and books are two different types of media, right? And in a film that you want to use as an educational resource, you do need a hook, right? I think Toussaint was a really good hook to use to get a actual person, right, to identify with, because very often historians get caught up in these sweeping grand forces and ideologies, and which are going to seem very abstract to a lot of students, right? So I think it may be about the emphasis on this one personality as a framing tool, which I can see again is useful for the level of instruction that you're going to be given, but you may want to augment this with some other material. Right? I was just thinking of another author who you might want to check up on, and this is a man who actually used to teach at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and that is Patrick Bellegarde Smith, right? Who's written several books about Haiti.
Okay, so we had someone say, would you compare the cult of Robespierre to Toussaint? Personally, I wouldn't, but I mean, is that something that you see?
No, I see more of Dessalines and Robespierre. Now,
Yeah.
Toussaint was, again, very much in the model of a modern colonial administrator. And, I don't think he was, a Black nationalist, right? If I can be, somewhat anachronistic, right? In the way that Dessalines was. He was not committed, to independence. He was committed to the idea that France could accept Black people as citizens on the basis of equality, fraternity, and liberty.
I wondered if we could end with one last question, which is about connections between African Americans and Haitians, in particular Frederick Douglass. And there's also other questions that are coming down the pike on ecology and the impact on Haiti in terms of the damage done there. But so feel free to answer as you like, but I think it would be interesting for our teachers to be able to make comparisons between why African Americans, especially during our Civil War or leading up to that, felt Haiti was such a strong example, and what connections have been built up between African Americans and Haitians historically.
Okay, well, I mentioned Haiti's isolation. The United States did not recognize Haiti until the Civil War, okay? Because it was unthinkable to recognize a country that had become independent as the result of a slave revolt. Right? Various American officials, expressed a puzzlement about how would they treat a Haitian official in a diplomatic context, right? How would they treat a person who they saw as a commodity, right? As somebody who should be a slave, right? How would they treat that person as an ambassador, right? Or a consul, right? So the United States didn't recognize Haiti. they attempted to establish unsuccessfully various commercial quarantines, right? The only thing I can compare that to in terms of, in contemporary terms, would be the United States' attitude toward Cuba, right? As a country whose ideology and history the United States does not accept, right? And therefore chooses to ostracize politically and diplomatically, right? Okay, so after the Civil War, Frederick Douglass, and I can't remember the dates, I think it's like 1880s and 90s, right? Is appointed minister to Haiti. Okay? And while there, he gets into it with the U.S. Navy, right? Which has a very colonial attitude toward, toward Haiti, and involved in instances of gunboat diplomacy and so on and so forth. Douglass defends Haiti, right? Haiti becomes, for African Americans, just one of those symbols of liberation. Another such symbol was even earlier when Britain abolishes slavery in its colonies. African Americans in the free states made a point of celebrating West India Emancipation Day, right? Because emancipation for African Americans would not come until 30 years later. Again, we're talking about the circulation of ideas in the Atlantic world, in which people of African descent both participate and initiate.
Well, I think that given the time, we should probably wrap up, but I would love to have you back at some point to talk about the more recent US impact on Haiti, from the Marine occupation all the way up to current day events. So there's so much to say and unpack here. And we didn't even get to some of the major topics, which would have been exciting, such as reparations and the role that, whether it wasn't reparations to Haiti, but that Haiti had to pay, and the impact of that. So there's so much more to unpack, and we would love to have you back. Thank you so much, Dr. Plummer, for a really fascinating presentation. Thank you to all of our participants. I'm so glad you were able to join us today. Thank you to Essie Lenchner for always a terrific job with her tech support. And again, if there's any other questions or any other feedback you'd like to send to Dr. Plummer, feel free to send it our way and we'll pass it on. But thank you so much for being here today, and we look forward to seeing you guys at our next film club, book club, and all the other events that we're doing. So take care, everyone. Bye.